Hello. Today we're going to be learning about Behind Closed Doors Facilitator Training. Behind Closed Doors is a role-playing process that we use for our staff to demonstrate their knowledge of policy and protocol in the residence halls. This module is meant to serve as an overview for head staff to understand what our process looks like and to give you some tools prior to the activity. Our process of Behind Closed Doors is a one-day process. There are 9 scenarios that occur in 3 hours time. The idea is that every new RA participate in at least one of those 9 scenarios. Each session will be roughly 15 minutes in length, including travel time, and there is a break in the middle of our Behind Closed Doors process. At the end of Behind Closed Doors, the group process happens at the staff level. It will be important to talk as a head staff on how you plan to discuss Behind Closed Doors after the activity has occurred. We have reduced our Behind Closed Doors scenarios. We have done 2 days in the past, and so it will be important to really break down these scenarios and ensure that staff are knowledgeable not only about the Behind Closed Doors practice that they participate in, but also the online videos that they were asked to watch that encompass the other scenarios that are missing from the activity itself this year. On the day of Behind Closed Doors, everyone is asked to report to the Gertie Pit. It's important for RAs who have been designated as actors, as well as graduate students who have been identified as discussion leaders, to check in with Sarah Hart and then report immediately to the room that they are supposed to be working in that day. The RA groups will be designated by letters, and those students will look for their letter in their name to find which group they belong to. That's only for new RAs. Group leaders will be given schedules and packet information that they will be asked to bring during the day of Behind Closed Doors. Sarah Hart will have a few extra copies, but it is very important that you bring those schedule and the packet with you to help facilitate any lost students. Looking at the roles for staff during Behind Closed Doors, you'll see that RAs and head staff have 2 different roles that we will discuss at length. But once again, it is very important that staff come to the Gertie Pit and check in prior to going to their designated locations. The first of the resident assistant roles is actor. We have 25 returning RAs that will be asked to act during Behind Closed Doors this year. The way that those RAs are selected to act is through their complex director. Their names are provided, and then during their actor training, which is from 1 to 1:30 p.m. on Saturday the 11th, they are asked to be placed in scenarios, or they're placed by random choice and then can swap out. It's important during that training structure for actor training that we're emphasizing the mentorship and the leadership aspects of being an actor. These students are by no means students that are perfect at every Behind Closed Doors scenario, but usually actors are returning RAs that have experienced the Behind Closed Doors process before, and we are confident that they have the maturity and the supportiveness to help their peers learn. Every other RA, and typically those are majority of new staff, are participants or support for the Behind Closed Doors process. As a participant, those are the folks that are actively working through the scenario provided. So in a group of 7, for example, they would be one person that is addressing the concern, and the remaining 6 individuals would be considered support. So they should be watching and observing what's happening, as well as debriefing with the group. We also have one volunteer on-deck person that is asked to be there as an assist for the person who is the participant. So for example, the participant could be someone who is a volunteer and then asking the group who would like to be on call, and then that person can be called into the scene if the participant would like some further support. The primary focus of the process for our participants as well as our support is that they're learning by addressing the situations to the best of their ability, and then we are assessing how we train them based on their response. In terms of head staff, our group leaders are responsible for the groups themselves. These individuals are typically complex directors or second-year graduate assistants who are responsible for the groups going to and from, as well as assessing what their performance has been like through the process. They are responsible for keeping track of the time. I can't stress this enough because time is a very important part of what we do in making sure that we're making staff rotate accordingly. Preparing the participants via selection and reading the prompt is also an important part of that role. For example, many group leaders will ask the group who would like to volunteer to do the next scenario. After designating that volunteer, They would then read the prompt on the facilitator packet to help make sure that that person knows what information they're supposed to prior to addressing the concern in the scenario. Group leaders are also responsible for observing and taking notes. Each will be provided with an assessment, which I'll show you in just a moment, that they'll fill out via a clipboard. Looking for themes is also an important part of the assessment process. The idea with the assessment process is not that we are watching individual RA performance, but that we're looking for themes of where RAs are experiencing challenges. So for example, if we see a theme that many of the RAs are having trouble with the documentation process as they're working with the actors, we know that we need to go back into training and develop this further. Group leaders are also helpful in terms of providing knowledge. So when asked, we'll talk about why only when asked in just a moment. And they're also responsible for just providing support and guidance between the scenes. It is not unlikely that students will be very comfortable with their group leaders, and after leaving the room and away from the other staff members, ask some additional questions and follow up. Before behind closed doors, group leaders should plan to prepare an activity to get to know your small group. We try to keep groups within the same staff, but there are going to be times when groups are mixed between staffs based on the numbers provided. So it is important that there's some kind of activity, if nothing else, to just kind of calm the students down prior to going in to the scenarios themselves. Group leaders should also be ready to guide volunteers through the prompts. And prior to the prompt starting, they should be ready to field any questions that staff members may have about addressing the concern. Our current process does not tell students what exactly they're addressing. Our prompts tend to be vague so that they can develop critical thinking to determine what's going on. But it is important to field any questions that they have prior to starting, and just making sure that the RA participant is in a good space before initiating that scenario. In addition, again, finding a volunteer and then checking with the actors that the room is ready. Prior to the scenario, they should also send the rest of the group into the room itself so that the supporters or non-participants within the group can be settled and ready to watch what's going on. Prepping the volunteer again, and then of course preparing your observation sheet. On the sheet itself, it asks what scenario and what individual is completing each of those scenes, so it is important for group leaders to make sure that is complete prior to starting. During the scenario, group leaders should be observing and taking notes on strengths and weaknesses of that staff member's performance. Themes are more important, again, than individual performance, particularly as we go through and you start to see trends within what your staff is doing, or your group, excuse me. Making sure the RAs are paying attention is also an important part of the group leader process. Again, by trying to keep them together within staffs, many of you will be working with students that will be a part of your staff, so helping them stay actively involved in what's going on will not only be important, but also assist you in making sure that they've learned the material. And again, group leaders are in charge of keeping track of the time and making sure that groups are not arriving too early or too late for each scenario. At the end of the scenario, group leaders will lead the group into the lounge for a debrief. So again, they would work through the concern, and then group leaders would bring them into the lounge to have that developmental discussion with the discussion leader. Group leaders would provide additional information only when needed. Again, the discussion leader will be the person that breaks down what's happened, so they should only be there as a resource and keeping time. At the end of Behind Closed Doors, the group leader will be responsible for turning in all assessment forms to Sarah Hart. That's important because we will use those for further evaluation and follow-up. The second head staff role is discussion leader. Discussion leaders are primarily going to stay in one place. They're going to stay in one room for the duration of the activity. And so it is important that before each scenario, that individual is going to their room and asking questions and knowing the procedure, the protocol as well as the policy associated with it. The discussion leader is meant to also serve as someone who is there to support the staff that are acting the scenario. Prepping the actors prior to each scene starting is helpful and should include checking on them for challenging rooms. Some of our material include things such as suicidal thoughts, domestic violence, and sexual assault. And so checking on the students is going to be very important to make sure that they're not being triggered themselves by participating as actors. Providing tips and directions to actors is also important. We want to make sure that the experience that our student participants are getting is consistent, as well as not too extreme in either way. We do talk with our actors prior to the start of Behind Closed Doors about making sure that this is not a hazing activity and that they're not being unsupportive in the way that they're acting. And so it is important that tips and directions are given. And then just ensuring that role swapping happens, particularly for those heavier rooms. A student should not spend 3 hours in one particular role in each room. Assisting the group movement into the room will be helpful. We're talking about the students who are not the volunteer, the rest of the group, helping them get settled. And then again, for accountability purposes, making sure that groups are not starting early. So discussion leader is really the person that is in control of that particular scenario's room. During each scenario, the discussion leader is asked to really pay attention to actor behavior and themes, as well as the participants' nonverbals and emotions. You will see as the discussion leader 7 to 9 different approaches to a particular scene, so it will be important that if you see a student undergoing additional stress, that you are the person who ends that scenario. You may stop the role playing after 5 to 8 minutes, or in the event that it is done. So sometimes that will mean that OPS has been called, or that the student is in a good place and has looked at you to kind of end. Whatever that looks like, you are the person who is calling it quits. Also, if applicable, you would work with the counselor during each scenario. This will look different depending on the room you have. Again, some of those heavier rooms will have support of our counseling team here at WIU. After each scenario, the discussion leader should help move the group into the lounge, and they are responsible for that debrief. It is important that the discussion leader is ready to discuss at length any questions that the students have, as well as looking in the facilitator packet to talk about desirable responses and any stress points that we want to make sure that we emphasize to our staff. Supporting the counselor in the room is also going to be important. Often our counselors will want to talk a little bit more and help debrief. And so really your role at that point would be to add in UHDS policy and protocol. At the end of the activity, discussion leaders are responsible for resetting the rooms back to the original Lincoln setup. That is important because we want to make sure that those rooms are back to the way that they were, if not in better condition than when we left them. After Behind Closed Doors concludes, staff teams will again do that full group debrief during in-hall. It's important to be prepared to answer any questions that they have, and also to steer them away from too many what-ifs. Sometimes we get a little bit too wrapped up in the hypothetical. We really want to stress just the basic protocol and give them the tools that they need in the event that they have any of these situations. After BCDs concludes, it's also going to be important to check in with them as a group as well as individually about how they feel about scenarios, including their level of preparedness. There are scenarios that are potentially triggering, and so working with students to identify what it is that they are nervous about in the future is going to be an important conversation as supervisors going forward. So at this time, that is where the quick overview of Behind Closed Doors. I encourage you to speak to your complex director or any of our central staff team if you have questions on Behind Closed Doors. Before exiting out, I do want to show you just a few things. So this is our group list. You can see that there are currently no names on there, but they will be added in. These are our current group leaders. And again, you'll see that, for example, Jalen Jones is in Group A. Her staff will be placed in those locations, and each group should have no more than 8 individuals in them each. Additionally, I want to show the assessment. The assessment has been trimmed down this year via the training committee to really focus on whether or not staff are below, meeting, or above expectations in these 3 critical areas. The first is approach. And so this is talking about how a staff member is approaching their scenario in terms of their demeanor, the ability to communicate, as well as identify what in fact the problem is. This may also work with more of the way in which a student is working and interacting with the actors. Are they coming in a little too strong, a little too soft? Are they just that right amount of awesome, that kind of thing? In terms of protocol, this is focusing more on procedure. Was the staff member hesitant or unsure of what to do in the scenario? Was the procedure outlined by what we've discussed in crisis response followed, or were they hesitant or unsure of what that was? Last but not least is resources. We spend a great deal of time, particularly in CSP 450, the RA class, on promoting and understanding the resources on campus. And so making sure that staff were utilizing and offering those outside resources, which ones, as well as just general knowledge about referrals is what we're looking for in that particular category. The back of the form can also be used for additional observations or areas of improvement. We recognize that there are limits between those three categories, but really from a training and assessment perspective, these are the three areas that we've identified as the most important for our first-time RAs. Next, I want to show you the schedule for Behind Closed Doors. As you can see, we start at 9:15 technically, with our actors coming in at 9 and immediately going into setup. It will be important, depending on your group letter, that you're following the schedule and based on the amount of time. Often during Behind Closed Doors, it's very easy for groups to get ahead, and this can be really challenging for our participants and our actors, because what ends up happening is you can hear others in the hall waiting for their turn, usually quietly chit-chatting and otherwise not intending to be distracting. So it is important this year especially that we're very much following what has been outlined, so that we are done exactly at 12 noon, and so our staff are not being overwhelmed or feeling rushed in addressing some of these. You'll also see at the bottom here the list of what incidents they're going to be working with this year. Again, any missing incidents from prior years have been worked into a module, so they are still going to be able to see how to participate in those kinds of crisis and policy needs. Last but not least is our facilitator packet. You will get a physical copy of the facilitator guide if you haven't gotten it already. And really, it is important to bring this regardless of your role on the day of Behind Closed Doors. You can see that there are additional instructions for facilitators. That is code for group leader. And you can see on here that we've also written out the instructions for participants. So group leaders can read directly from there on what should be happening. You'll also see that for each scenario, it will show you whether or not a counselor is in the room. That's indicated up here. How many actors to expect, props, which are provided by the department, and then the prompt that group leaders should be reading to participants. Actors are given this information, and then again, the desired responses are good for group facilitation from our discussion leader, as well as those processing questions again. Again, it says facilitator, but we intend for this particular one to be done by our discussion leader. Each of these are a page in length, but overall, again, there are 9 scenarios. These take up quite a bit of paper, so once again, I stress that you should please bring your facilitator guide with you to Behind Closed Doors. If I am a discussion leader, for example, in scenario 9, all I need to know is this particular scenario as a new staff member. We highly encourage you to know all of them, but scenario 9 is the only one that you would truly need for the day of Behind Closed Doors. So with that, that is training for Behind Closed Doors facilitation. I encourage you again to ask questions, particularly of returning staff, central staff, head staff, or complex directors, and thank you for your time.